Today we're talking about 6G and what's going on with that new cellular standard. So that's me. My email address is there. If you'd like to email me, feel free to do so. You can also feel free to find me on LinkedIn. So real quick before we jump into the content, the telecom practice at TBR produces a variety of syndicated reports across tier one operators, tier one vendors, as well as topic-specific reports around private cellular networks, telecom infrastructure services, hyperscaler, CapEx, and a variety of other reports. But for today, we're going to be talking through some of the findings from our market forecast, market landscape pertaining to the 5G and 6G market, and then a little bit from the Telecom AI report that we produce, as well as sharing some of the content from the most recent special reports about 6G, one of which is from my takeaways from the Brooklyn 6G Summit and takeaways from the predictions we produced for this year. I know 6G is still a few years away, but as we know with other cellular generations, the work on these things starts several years, at least at a minimum, several years before the standard is, the standards process is fully underway. So with that, the agenda today, we're going to set the stage and expectations for 6G. We're going to look at what spectrum band 6G is likely going to leverage. We're going to look at how 6G might shape CSP CapEx investments. And when I use the term CSP, I'm referring to communication service providers, aka telcos. And lastly, we're going to look at how governments might get involved to ensure 6G becomes a reality, and finish it up with key takeaways. So setting the stage, the reality is the telecom industry continues to struggle with new revenue and growing, and 5G is continuing the problems the industry had that began with 4G, which is we spent a lot of money on infrastructure build out and spectrum, and the ROI just did not materialize. And 6G is shaping up to be another continuation of what we've seen with 4G and now 5G. We don't really see any catalysts that are going to change that. But I want to peel back those layers and talk through some of those things real quick. So for some context here, globally, telcos have spent several $100 billion so far on 5G infrastructure and spectrum. And we have not seen profitable revenue growth to at any level of magnitude come from those investments. The justification thus far for 5G has been a way to reduce cost per bit further. So there's an OpEx savings component here. And telcos have also justified spend to make sure that they are able to be competitive from a marketing perspective for their customers. So if your competitor has 5G and you don't, that could cause subscribers to churn. So there's a FUD aspect here for telcos to invest in 5G to make sure that they protect their customer bases and potentially attract new customers if they have 5G and maybe their competition does not. FWA has been successful, and I want to give it credit here. However, the amount of revenue that's been generated from FWA is a small fraction of the hundreds of billions of dollars that's been invested. So it is a small partial offset from an ROI standpoint for 5G. So FWA is great, but there needs to be a lot more innovation and new business models and new use cases that are commercialized at scale to justify the investment in 5G. Additionally, only about 20% of telcos globally have begun deploying a 5G core, aka a standalone architecture. And as we know, this is going to be a prerequisite for 6G. So if you don't have the 5G core, if you're not running a 5G SA architecture, you can't do 6G. So the telcos are behind in that key stepping stone to on the road to 6G. We see technological complexity increasing, and this creates issues. It slows the process of deployment down. Open vRAN, it's happening, but it's not happening at any level of scale that it needs to happen to bring the fundamental change that the industry needs in terms of cost of infrastructure and the flexibility of that infrastructure to do things like network slicing and participation in marketplaces, et cetera. We have a higher interest rate environment, which equals higher cost of capital, which equals tighter CapEx environment. Because the telcos, if they want to invest more money now, we're not in a NERP environment anymore, or a ZERP environment, negative interest rates and zero interest rate world. Those days are over. And the global business community is now adjusting to this new reality of higher rates and how that impacts their cost of capital and the decisions they're making as to CapEx and other investments. So, telco appetite for and scope of 6G is going to likely be limited, especially if we think about it from a pure private sector standpoint. The public sector is going to have to get more involved through stimulus and other incentives to push 6G forward at any level of scale. This is what we're expecting to happen, and we already see glimmers of this. We're going to talk about that. So the first prediction we have is that 6G is going to leverage the FR3 spectrum tranche. And this is a mid-band, on the upper end of mid-band. It is before millimeter wave. So it's not millimeter wave, it's centimeter wave spectrum at the higher end of mid-band. That's what we're talking about here. New spectrum is going to be needed to support network traffic growth. Yes, network traffic growth is slowing on a year-over-year basis. However, it's still growing in aggregate, and the numbers are huge. So from an absolute value standpoint, there needs to be new capacity put into the system, and into global networks, and 6G in new spectrum bands is going to be very important to satisfy that. Supporting the capacity that's going to be needed here. So specifically, the FR3 spectrum tranche is 7 gigahertz to 24 gigahertz. That's the range we're talking about. And of which the 7 to 15 is the golden range. So that's really the portion of this FR3 that is the most desirable and the highest, there's the most hope put around that portion of the tranche for 6G from a propagation standpoint, and from an availability standpoint in terms of harmonization across multiple countries. Some of the issues, though, with this band, this golden range, if we look at the states, government entities and satellite and other stakeholders of spectrum are using some of those bands. So there needs to be coexistence. There needs to be systems put in place, mechanisms put in place, regulation put in place to enable those bands to be leveraged for telecom use, for cellular communication use. And of course, we also have Wi-Fi that is a key stakeholder in this ecosystem that is looking for spectrum allocated for unlicensed purposes. So everybody needs to play nice in this tranche, and there's going to need to be quite a bit of evolution there and coexistence. And the industry, we expect the industry is going to be focusing on how that might look in the context of 6G. The second prediction is around CapEx spend. We've already established that telcos are struggling to derive ROI from 5G, and the economic value that was promised from 5G has yet to materialize. So why would 6G be any different? What is the difference here? We've heard the same story with 4G, we heard it with 5G, and we're already hearing it with 6G. But is there credibility to that statement? As of right now, we are struggling to see a catalyst that's going to fundamentally change the situation for telcos in the 6G era. Now, I know a lot can happen in 5 years, but as of right now, we do not see a catalyst. We don't see a material change from what we've seen from 5G. What we do see for 6G is it's going to help address cost per bit. It's going to help with sustainability objectives, things of that nature. But it is not likely to help materially change the revenue picture, the revenue growth picture for telcos. Given that, we're expecting that 6G CapEx is going to be relatively subdued relative to what happened in 4G and 5G. So there's going to be a lot of investment on 6G, but it's unlikely to attain the levels that we've seen with 4G and 5G, which is this multi-$100 billion investment borne by the telcos, by the private sector, to invest in the technology. Something's going to have to change. So for 5G, thus far, the global telecom ecosystem, so telcos, specifically telcos, have spent more than $300 billion on infrastructure and spectrum. And there's no ROI from this. So we're expecting that 6G is going to be a fraction of this number. From a private sector standpoint, we're going to talk about the public sector now and how that might change the equation a bit. But if we look at history and we project that forward and we consider potential catalysts on the horizon, this is where we're coming from for these predictions. It's going to be a challenging CapEx environment. Telcos are suffering from high leverage. They've taken on a lot of debt to buy spectrum, like C-band spectrum, as an example. And it's going to be really hard for them to do that again. From an investment justification standpoint, but even from a raw spend standpoint, their balance sheets just can't support that again. It can't happen unless there is a outside influence with capital that is going to change the equation. So that brings us to the third prediction here. We are expecting the public sector to get involved in a very significant way to change the calculus for investment in critical strategic technologies like 6G so that it actually does happen at scale. So government support, we are expecting for 6G is going to increase. We already saw this with 5G. We've seen the US, we've seen the EU, we've seen China, and select other countries like South Korea and Japan and Australia step up to the plate with public funding and a variety of other stimulative mechanisms to encourage private sector investment in 5G. We're expecting the same thing to happen with 6G, but at a much bigger scale, bigger magnitude, bigger dollar values. The justification for public spending, public funding, and stimulus for this is for societal and national security reasons. These are the drivers justifying the spend on strategic technologies. And we're expecting governments to become much bigger influencers in and embedded stakeholders in the wireless technology ecosystem. This is a big deal. And if the telcos can't make it happen for whatever reason, we're going to see other stakeholders of the broader technology ecosystem and the public sector step in, and they're going to play a bigger role here for their own vested interests. What does government stimulus look like? I made a list. Solution purchases. This is situations where the government agencies are buying technology solutions from the private sector. This is stimulative. The governments already do this with 5G. Think about mission critical communications, things like FirstNet, things like private LTE or private 5G solutions for blue light services. This is a way of stimulating the market. Direct capital infusions. We saw this during the great financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, where the US government stepped in and backstopped the automobile industry during a challenging period for that industry. And they also did capital infusions, direct and indirect, into the financial companies that had issues during that crisis, and they backstopped them. We are expecting to see this as well. Indirect capital infusions. This is situations where there might be regulatory policy, big bills that come through that have an indirect benefit to the technology sector. Think about things like clean energy. There might be stimulus funding available for clean energy, and there might be situations where technology companies can tap into that public sector funding. Low or zero interest rate loans. This has taken on new importance now that we are in a more normalized interest rate environment, where telcos might be paying 5 to 10% interest rates for funding CapEx. The governments can come in and be very stimulative by providing a loan at a subsidized interest rate to encourage investment by the private sector. We're going to see a lot of this. We've already been seeing a lot of this, and we're going to see a lot more of this. And interest rate policy. So the Federal Reserve, the central banks of the world, set interest rate policy. We might see situations where interest rates are reduced to stimulate economic development. We're already seeing some of this in terms of positioning for the energy sector and the AI sector and other strategic sectors where interest rates might be adjusted to encourage investment by the private sector. Implicit guarantees against failure. This also has an indirect impact on the interest rates a company that might have a precarious balance sheet will actually pay. We see this with the banking sector, the GSIBs, global systemically important institutions, where there's an implicit guarantee by the government of that, where that company's domiciled, that they will backstop the bank if it gets into trouble. We saw this during the GFC. We've seen it since then. We're going to continue to see this. And we might even see this extend to vendors and telcos that are deemed to be strategic entities that must continue on no matter what. The governments would get involved in that. Most recently, we've seen this in Europe, where the water sector, water infrastructure has implicit guarantees. And I'm thinking of the UK, and I'm thinking of Germany, where Uniper, which is a very critical company in the energy sector in Germany, has been backstopped, bailed out against and protection against failure. So this list there's precedent for everything that's listed on this list as part of mechanisms that are in the playbook for the government sector to employ. Subsidies. We see build and buy in a certain country as coming with more favorable economic considerations. We might see tariffs. That also changes the calculus. That also changes where R&D might be spent. These are things that need to be considered. Tax policy. We're seeing situations where companies might get more favorable tax treatment or more adverse tax treatment, depending on how and where they're making their critical investments. This is something that governments are using increasingly to for their interests, to steer their economies in a certain direction. And we are absolutely going to see this in play in the technology sector, not just for 6G, but more broadly across the tech sector, which is strategically important. We've talked about tariffs. This also would have an impact on the competition, so that has to be factored into the calculus. I see a bunch of questions in the Q&A box. Just keep aggregating those and we'll take them one by one at the end. And note, this list is not comprehensive. These are some of the more common mechanisms that governments use to stimulate or tweak or encourage or incentivize their economies to move in a certain direction. This list is by no means comprehensive. 6G is absolutely going to be factored in to these considerations. So, takeaways. The telecom industry is struggling. We're going to hear more about these struggles at Mobile World Congress and how the telecom industry might address these things with AI, how that might unlock new opportunities. And I'm going to be looking for that, the messaging around that at the event. But 6G is going to be a continuation of 5G. And as we specified before, 5G core, the 5G SA architecture, these are the foundational building blocks that need to be in place for the telcos to even consider migration into 6G. So the real question is, how are the telcos going to justify those investments? Where might that stimulus come from to encourage that investment? And these are things that have to be considered when we start to think about what the 6G era might look like from a telco perspective. The telco appetite for and scope of investment for 6G is likely to be relatively limited. It will likely be much less than what was spent in aggregate on 4G and 5G, unless there's some major catalyst that's going to change that, which we've already talked about. And to change that calculus, we're expecting the public sector to step up in a very big way to change the investment ideology and how the industry might approach strategic technologies like 6G. So with that, we'll open it up for Q&A. So I'm going to go down the list one by one, so bear with me. Okay, there's a bunch of questions in the queue. We'll get to as many as we can. I did budget extra time for questions because I know this is a hot topic, so We're going to do about 20 minutes of Q&A right now, and then we'll end the call. So the first question is, I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment. So this is about FWA. So it's more of a comment. It's about fixed wireless and basically it being a good way to provide broadband internet at very low cost relative to fixed access. And yes, it is. There are a lot of benefits with FWA in terms of go-to-market timing. So you can get that set up much faster than having to build out fixed access infrastructure. There's infrastructure sharing costs that make it more attractive. There's you can piggyback on MBB, on your MBB infrastructure to provide FWA with spare capacity, which a lot of telcos do this. So there's FWA is a very attractive offering that does use 5G. It can use LTE, but it's way better with 5G. Much more competitive against fiber and XDSL and coax or HFC and satellite now relative to what LTE would be. So yeah, FWA is great, but again, I want to stress, you got to look at magnitude. And the magnitude shows, when you do the aggregations, that the ROI for 5G investment is still not there. It's still missing. And the telcos are really struggling to figure that out. And there still is there's no easy solution to address this chasm. All right, the next question is, okay, that was building on the prior one about FWA. So the next question, bear with me, some of these are comments. I'm going to skip the comments and go straight to the questions. So this person's talking about direct equity purchases are the main means by which U.S. Treasury promotes telecom. We don't need banks or loans. Simple stock purchases are the primary means that governments use to promote capitalization. And they're talking about state-owned enterprises as an example of this. So yes, absolutely. Equity purchase is absolutely one mechanism. But there's others. Like, think about the implicit guarantees against failure. That has an impact on the rate, the risk premium that's charged for holding that entity's debt. So that indirectly benefits the entity, the company, because it lowers the perceived risk of the company and it lowers the cost of capital for that company. So it's not just equity purchase. There are other mechanisms that are used by government, that are used today, that have been used in the past to change cost of capital and to promote investment by companies or industries. So I want to stress that point. It's not just about equity. The next question is, bear with me 1 second. I'm weeding through the comments. With all the impact of overspending CapEx for 5G, why don't more investors demand more change of management? And why invest in 6G at all with the same management? So telco managers are doing well with what, if you look at it from a traditional standpoint, telcos traditionally, in terms of the traditional business model of selling connectivity, I would argue managers are actually doing a pretty good job. They're delivering earnings per share growth, mostly by cutting costs. Some telcos are taking market share, like T-Mobile, so they're doing relatively better than the competition. And they're basically doing well with what they've had. But we're not really seeing where they need to go. And where they need to go is beyond connectivity. With connectivity being part of the equation of value and value conveyance in the broader markets in which they operate, but how do they participate in the data opportunity and monetizing data in different ways? We see some telcos, like I'll come back to T-Mobile, monetizing advertising, digital ads through using their subscriber data. That's one mechanism of doing that, but it needs to be much broader than that. And the business models need to evolve. It can't just be about unlimited all-you-can-eat data at a cost that is in a commoditized competitive environment. That's not sustainable. We're also seeing telecom managers doing M&A to extract more synergies out of the traditional business model. So again, from a traditional business model perspective, I would argue telco managers are doing a really good job. But where they're not really getting there, where things need to change, is in terms of the evolution of the traditional business model. And that's where we need to see visionaries coming in and changing the calculus. And again, we've been very vocal about this. We do believe that the hyperscalers are going to be disruptive players in the connectivity value chain, where they are providing the connectivity and they're monetizing it with different business models. Look at what Apple is doing. They have a network that they're building through Globalstar and other investments that they're making, through advancements in modem technology and other endpoint device investments they're making. They have a different business model, a different way of justifying the investments, a different inputs to their ROI equation that justifies the investment in these technologies that a telco might not have. That's where we're really going to see change, transformational change in the telecom ecosystem. Okay, there's a bunch more questions coming in. I see them. We're going to get through as many as we can, so just bear with me here. The next question is, what are the longer-term implications of the emerging satellite network providers taking subscribers and disintermediating the traditional wireless carriers, relegating them to wholesale connectivity? So this builds on what I was just saying about Apple and the satellites. All of the hyperscalers have satellite partnerships, or they own satellite networks outright, right? So Amazon is building Project Kuiper, right? That would be an example of them owning that network. I understand that they have not begun putting that in space yet, but they're going to make a lot of progress on that this year. So the longer term implications, again, if you're looking at the traditional telco business model of connectivity, that model is under threat, existential threat. And if the telcos don't start branching out beyond connectivity, I'm not saying to abandon connectivity, I'm saying that they need to bridge that with other business models like the hyperscalers are doing. They need to find ways where they can do that, as well as find ways to participate in the broader value chain, maybe partnering with the hyperscalers and other technology firms or enterprises in other sectors to bring value, new value that leverages connectivity, but where the ROI equation is factoring in other inputs. That's what they need to do. If they don't do it, they're going to be disintermediated. Okay, the next question is, what are the 6G value over 5G and what killer apps will 6G support? It's about the business case, for sure. So cost per bit reduction and sustainability are going to be, and when I say sustainability, I'm talking about energy reduction. So energy in and what you're getting for output from that energy in. So those are two major key points I want to stress for telcos. This is also going to be a justification for some governments where that's an objective. 6G will help further reduce the cost per bit for delivering connectivity and carrying the traffic. Beyond that, if we look at the revenue growth standpoint, it's going to be about, I really do want to talk about the metaverse. I know that this topic has taken some bruises over the last few years, but I want to be very clear. The metaverse concept, and when I say metaverse, I mean AR, VR. This is going to happen, and it's going to be huge. We're talking trillions of dollars in new economic value from AR and VR. It is going to be huge. The question is when. And if we look at technology and ecosystem development, if we look at technology roadmaps and ecosystem development and the pace of breakthroughs, critical breakthroughs, the 2030s, we are likely going to see AR, VR become a $1 trillion+ new market opportunity for the world economy. And 6G is going to be a critical technology, enabling technology for AR and VR applications. So what we've seen so far with AR, VR is glimpses of what's coming. And it's going to have a profound impact across the business, business sectors, and from a consumer standpoint. So 6G is going to be huge there. We'll leave it at that. I want to get to some other questions, but that's going to be one of the major use cases or killer apps, if you will, to justify the investment in 6G, because you're going to need a 5G core, you're going to need a standalone architecture, you're going to need ultra low latency at scale, and you're going to need ultra high capacity. And 6G is going to be able to deliver that. 5G Advanced will as well. I don't want to belittle 5G Advanced. There's going to be specs for 5G Advanced that are critical for enabling things like AR, VR. Okay. The next question is... the next question is, give me 1 second. I'm just parsing through some comments. I see the comments too, but we're going to go through questions only here. Historically, a generation of wireless technology lasts 10 years. 5G deployment started in 2018, so I think ROI will need a few more years. So, I mean, yeah, it takes 10 years roughly, but come on. We're 7 years, let's say 6 years. Okay, we're 6 years into the 5G cycle. And we have no clear path to ROI. I mean, how many more years do we need? Look at LTE. I mean, the telcos still haven't recouped the investment from LTE. And the value went to the over-the-top players, the Netflixes, the Ubers, the hyperscalers of the world. They are the ones that primarily benefited from the LTE investments. From an aggregate standpoint, the telcos did not benefit from those investments at a large enough scale to justify the amount of money they put in. So I'm going to push back a little bit on that. And after 6 years of being in the 5G market, the industry should be further along than it is. And honestly, NSA, I wouldn't even consider that to be 5G. That's a Band-Aid on the way to 5G. you need a 5G core and you need a standalone architecture. You need to be running that at scale to be considered 5G in terms of what 5G has been pitched as from an industry standpoint. And against that metric, only about 20% of telcos globally are in that category where they're actually deploying something that would be considered a 5G network. The next question is around capacity, raw capacity, 10G to the end user to support things like AR, VR. And this person is saying or implying that you might need fixed access to do that. I would push back a little bit on that. 5G is like wireless fiber. You can get multi-gig downlink sustained on a 5G connection, and it can be deployed at scale. The problem is that the infrastructure cost to do that is prohibitive. It's not justified. And the second point is the spectrum that's available to run the 5G there's not enough contiguous spectrum. You would need, multi-hundred megahertz channels, blocks of spectrum to support that type of an outcome. And so from that standpoint, true. But I would like to present a alternative way of thinking about this. Wi-Fi is broadly used today, and you can get multi-hundred gig or multi-gig downlink on Wi-Fi using 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. What if you could use the 6 to 7 gigahertz band in which there is up to 1,200 megahertz of bandwidth and do carrier aggregation and massive MIMO and layer in some other spectral technologies? You can do this at scale, and you can do this in a cost-effective manner. And I firmly believe, based on what I have seen in terms of innovation and roadmaps and where these things are trending, I firmly believe that fixed access is not the only game in town for some of these high capacity use cases like AR and VR. Okay, I'm going to do one more question and we're going to close it up for this. So yeah, I see some questions here about basically building on what I was just saying about what can be done in unlicensed spectrum and the engineering and the design of the architecture, that these networks could be built super cheap. And yes, absolutely 100% agree with that statement. Networks as they have traditionally been built, and I'm talking about cellular networks specifically right now, there are technologies available, and we're going to hear about some of these at Mobile World Congress, I'm sure, where these networks could be built at a fraction of the cost of what networks have traditionally been built as, leveraging things such as Open RAN, virtual RAN, AI, leveraging AI in the software stack. There's going to be significant innovation on the network infrastructure layer that can dramatically bring down the cost of building and operating the networks. And watch the hyperscalers, because they're actually doing this. They're doing it at scale. And they're doing it at a magnitude that the industry has not seen before. Look at network backbone architectures. Look at what they're doing with wiring up their AI data centers and how they're using a different network topology to support those transit workloads.